The winter of 1943 was one of the coldest Europe had ever known. The sky above northern Germany hung low and gray, its silence broken only by the distant thunder of engines, hundreds of American bombers cutting through the air in tight formation. Their mission was simple, brutal, and precise: strike the heart of the German war machine, no matter the cost. Among them flew a young pilot, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, in command of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress known as Ye Olde Pub. It was his very first combat mission. The crew, 10 men barely out of their teens, had trained together for months, but nothing could prepare them for what awaited over Bremen. As they approached the city, the flak began. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire erupted all around them, shattering the calm with deafening concussions. Metal fragments tore through the fuselage, smashing instruments, puncturing fuel lines, and wounding men. The bomber shuddered under the impact. Brown gritted his teeth, fighting to keep control. The target was hit, the bombs released, but the cost was catastrophic. 2 engines were gone. The tail gunner was dead. The navigator was bleeding heavily. Holes the size of fists gaped through the wings, and the once proud fortress now limped alone, falling behind the formation. "Stay with me," Brown shouted over the intercom, but static drowned his voice. The intercom line was damaged. One by one, the other bombers disappeared into the haze, leaving Ye Olde Pub alone in enemy airspace. Below them, the German countryside stretched endlessly, fields, forests, and frozen rivers glinting under the pale winter sun. It was beautiful and deadly. Brown knew that every minute they remained in the air meant one more chance for German fighters to find them, and they did. A group of Messerschmitt Bf 109s spotted the wounded bomber and climbed to intercept. From his cockpit, Brown saw them coming, small black dots at first, then glints of silver wings growing larger, faster. The gunners in the fortress were ready, what few still had working guns, that is. But their ammunition was low, and their strength was fading. The first attack came in a storm of cannon fire. The bomber was hit again, the tail nearly torn away. The right stabilizer was shredded. Miraculously, the engines kept coughing just enough power to stay airborne. When the German fighters broke away, Brown looked around the cockpit and saw only blood, smoke, and frost. His co-pilot was unconscious. The temperature inside the plane had dropped below freezing. Frost clung to their oxygen masks. He thought it was the end. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw another fighter approaching. Not a group this time, just one, a single Messerschmitt, its propeller glinting in the cold sunlight, closing in from behind. Charlie Brown's hands tightened on the controls. He was too weak to fight, too slow to flee. The guns were silent, most of them destroyed. He could only watch. The German fighter moved in behind the bomber's tail, the perfect firing position. Brown waited for the final attack. But instead of firing, the Messerschmitt slid to the side, leveling off just a few meters from the shattered B-17. Through the cracked glass of his cockpit, Charlie could see the other pilot's face. Young, clean-shaven, eyes sharp with focus, but there was no hate in them. That pilot was Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace who had already brought down more than 24 Allied aircraft. For him, this was supposed to be another victory. But as he approached the wounded fortress, something stopped him cold. He could see the damage, gaping holes along the fuselage, the tail almost gone. He could see the crew inside, tending to their wounded. Through the glass nose, he even saw one man lying still, slumped over his gun. It was no fight anymore. It was a massacre waiting to happen, and Franz Stigler, the German fighter pilot, had to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. For a few silent seconds, the two aircraft hung side by side in the pale sky, one barely alive, the other strong and ready to kill. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown and his crew could hardly believe what they were seeing. A German fighter, close enough to touch, its guns aimed but still. In the other cockpit, Franz Stigler was staring at the wreckage of what had once been a proud bomber. He could see the bullet holes, the exposed ribs of metal, the shredded tail fabric fluttering in the wind. He could even make out the faces of the crew, frightened, pale, exhausted beyond reason. Franz had flown countless missions for the Luftwaffe. He had seen his comrades burned alive in their planes, and had watched Allied bombers rain destruction on German cities. By every rule of war, this crippled enemy was his prey. His finger could have ended it all in a heartbeat, but as he looked closer, something inside him shifted. The code he had been taught as a pilot was simple: destroy the enemy. Yet beneath that order lay an older code, one that had been passed to him, not by generals, but by his mentor, Gustav Rodel. "If I ever see you shooting a man in a parachute," Rodel had once said, "I'll shoot you myself. You fight with honor, or you don't fight at all." To Franz, this battered B-17 was no longer an enemy. It was a crippled bird trying desperately to find its way home. He eased his plane closer, close enough to see the American pilot's face, smeared with blood, eyes wide with confusion. Franz gestured with his hand, trying to signal, but Brown, terrified, misunderstood. He thought the German was mocking him or preparing to attack. Inside the B-17, the surviving gunners tried to aim their damaged weapons, but the guns were jammed. They were helpless. Charlie could only stare, not knowing whether to brace for death or hope for a miracle. And then it happened, the unthinkable. Franz held his fire. Instead of circling for a kill, he pulled alongside the bomber, matching its speed and altitude. He motioned with his hand, pointing north, toward the North Sea, away from German territory. His eyes said what words could not. "Turn that way. Go home." Charlie hesitated. His crew begged him not to trust it. "It's a trick," one shouted. But deep down, something told him otherwise. The German pilot's face was calm, resolute, almost compassionate. So slowly, Charlie adjusted course, heading toward the sea. Franz stayed beside him, close enough that the two aircraft seemed tethered by an invisible line. Together, they flew over the German coast, past anti-aircraft positions that could have easily mistaken the formation for an attack. Stigler knew this. If the gunners below opened fire, he'd be shot down along with the Americans. Still, he stayed. Inside the bomber, the men watched in stunned silence. They had seen mercy, not just luck, not confusion, but a deliberate act of humanity. For several minutes, the two planes flew like that, enemies bound by honor. Finally, as the bomber crossed the coastline and the waters of the North Sea shimmered below, Franz knew it was time. He could go no farther without being spotted by Allied fighters. He drew up alongside one last time. He looked through the shattered glass and locked eyes with Charlie Brown. Then he raised one hand, in a gesture that needed no translation, a salute. Charlie, still gripping the controls, lifted his own trembling hand in return. Then Franz banked his Messerschmitt gently to the left, away from the bomber, disappearing back into the clouds. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the silence was deafening. No one spoke for a long time. The crew stared at the empty sky, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Somewhere below, the German pilot was flying home, knowing full well that if anyone discovered what he had done, he could be court-martialed, even executed. To spare an enemy was to betray the Reich. But Franz didn't care. He had done what he believed was right, what was human. And high above the North Sea, Charlie Brown's crippled bomber limped onward toward England. Every engine knock, every shuddering gust of wind was a reminder that their survival had come not from chance, but from the mercy of a man they had been taught to call the enemy. That night, when the bomber finally landed on British soil, it was a miracle that the aircraft even held together. Mechanics counted more than 300 bullet holes. None of them could explain how the plane had stayed in the air. As the crew stumbled out, medics rushing to meet them, Charlie said only one thing before collapsing. "There was a German fighter. He had us dead to rights, and he let us go." The war ended, as all wars do, not with clarity or peace, but with exhaustion. In May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were broken, families scattered, and millions of lives extinguished. For men like Charlie Brown, survival felt less like victory and more like the weight of a memory that would never fade. When he returned home to West Virginia, he was 23 years old and already carried a lifetime inside him. The story of the German pilot, the man who had every reason to kill him but didn't, haunted him. He spoke of it once to his superiors in the debriefing after his final mission, but they dismissed it. "You're lucky he ran out of ammo," one officer said. Another laughed and told him to forget it. So he did what most men of his generation did. He went home, found work, built a life, and locked away the memories. The story became a private ache, something to think about in the quiet hours of the night. For the next 4 decades, Charlie Brown lived as many veterans did, quietly, humbly. He worked for the U.S. State Department, raised a family, and tried to make sense of the world he had nearly died to protect. Yet sometimes, when he looked up and saw the contrails of an airplane stretching across the sky, the image came back to him, the face of that German pilot, young and solemn, saluting him above the frozen North Sea. He never knew what became of the man. He didn't know if he'd survived the war, if he'd been punished for showing mercy, or if he'd died in the chaos that consumed Germany's final days. The war had scattered millions into silence, and for 40 years the trail was cold. On the other side of the world, Franz Stigler was living a different kind of quiet. After the collapse of Nazi Germany, he had fled the ruins of his homeland and emigrated to Canada. Like many former Luftwaffe pilots, he carried both pride and shame, pride in his skill and his comrades, shame in what his country had become. He never told anyone the full story of that December morning. How could he? To speak of sparing an enemy was to admit to treason, even in peacetime. For years it remained his private memory, a moment that defined his humanity more than all his victories combined. He worked as a flight instructor, teaching young pilots the same discipline and respect for the sky that his mentor had once taught him. When students asked about his wartime service, he spoke only in brief, detached terms. He never mentioned the B-17, never mentioned the salute, yet the memory stayed with him, a ghost that never left his cockpit. Sometimes, on long flights across the Canadian wilderness, he'd glance out of his window at the clouds and wonder if the American pilot had made it home. He hoped so. Years passed. The war faded from newspapers and textbooks into history. But for both men, it was not history. It was something living, something unfinished. Then, one winter night in 1986, more than 40 years after the mission over Bremen, Charlie Brown found himself thinking again about that encounter. He was retired now, his children grown. He had time to wonder, time to search. He sat down at his desk, opened a blank piece of paper, and began to write. To any Luftwaffe veterans who may have served over northern Germany in December 1943, I was the pilot of a B-17 bomber that was severely damaged after a raid on Bremen. I was spared by a German fighter who escorted my aircraft out to sea before turning away. I have always wished to know who he was. He mailed copies of the letter to veterans organizations across Europe, hoping for a response. Months passed, and none came. But Charlie was patient. He knew the odds were against him. After all, how many German pilots from 1943 were still alive? Still, he kept trying. More letters, more newspaper clippings, more archives. Each time he signed his name and ended with the same words: "If you are that pilot, or if you know who he was, please contact me." For nearly 4 years, nothing. Then, in early 1990, a letter arrived from Vancouver, British Columbia. The handwriting was careful, almost formal. The return name read, Franz Stigler. Inside were just a few lines. "Dear Mr. Brown, I believe I was the one who met you in December 1943, near Bremen. If you are the pilot of the B-17 that I escorted out to sea, then I am glad to know that you made it home. I would very much like to meet you." Charlie Brown sat in silence for a long time after reading it. The letter trembled in his hands. 46 years of questions, guilt, and gratitude, answered in a single page. The man who had spared his life was alive, and he wanted to meet. Spring sunlight filtered through the tall pines of Vancouver in 1990, when two old men, each carrying the weight of a lifetime, prepared to meet for the first time. For weeks they had exchanged letters and phone calls, cautiously confirming the details of that fateful mission in 1943. The description of the aircraft damage, the time of day, the flight path, everything matched. There was no doubt. Franz Stigler was the German pilot who had spared Charlie Brown's bomber. When the day finally arrived, Charlie flew from the United States to Canada, his heart pounding like it had the day his B-17 shuddered over the North Sea. He was in his late 60s now, his hair silver, his gait slower, but the memory remained as sharp as the sound of flak exploding in the sky. Franz Stigler waited at the airport, equally anxious. He was 74 years old, tall, still upright, his eyes bright with a mixture of fear and hope. He had spent most of his adult life wondering whether that B-17 had made it home. He had imagined the worst, that it had crashed into the sea or been shot down moments after he turned away. Now, after 46 years, he was about to learn the truth. When Charlie walked into the terminal, they saw each other immediately, two strangers bound by a single moment in history. There was no hesitation. Charlie stepped forward, and Franz opened his arms. The two men embraced, wordless at first, the way brothers might after decades apart. For a long time, neither could speak. Then Charlie whispered, his voice trembling, "I never thought I'd see you again." Franz's reply was quiet, almost reverent. "I never stopped thinking about you." They sat together for hours that day, in a small cafe overlooking the runway. The conversation moved slowly at first, halting, emotional, but soon it flowed like a river that had been dammed for too long. They spoke not only of the mission, but of everything that had come after, the families they built, the lives they led, the ghosts they carried. Franz told Charlie about his decision that day, how he had seen the blood in the gunner's compartment, how he had watched one of the crew tending to another's wounds, and how when he looked through the nose of the bomber, he had seen fear and desperation, not menace. "I couldn't shoot," Franz said, his eyes glistening. "They were no longer my enemies. They were human beings who had suffered enough. Killing you would have been murder." Charlie listened in silence, his throat tight. All those years, he had tried to understand why that pilot had shown mercy. Now, hearing it from the man himself, he felt both relief and awe. He reached across the table and grasped Franz's hand. "You saved more than our lives," he said. "You saved something inside me, the belief that even in war there can be decency." Over the next few days, they met repeatedly, walking together, sharing photographs, trading stories. Charlie showed Franz an old black-and-white picture of WWII pub after its emergency landing in England, riddled with holes but miraculously intact. Franz smiled and touched the edge of the photo gently, as though he were touching the past itself. "I remember this plane," he said softly. "I remember thinking it looked like a wounded eagle." As they talked, the bond between them deepened. What began as gratitude evolved into friendship, and soon into something closer to family. Franz had no children of his own. Charlie's sons began calling him Uncle Franz. They attended reunions together, visited air museums, and spoke publicly about their story, not to glorify war, but to remind people what compassion looked like in its rarest form. At air shows and veteran gatherings, crowds often fell silent when the two men walked on stage together, one in an American uniform cap, the other wearing the insignia of the Luftwaffe. The sight of them side by side was disarming, humbling. "I met my brother in the sky," Charlie would tell the audience. "He just happened to be flying for the other side." Their friendship lasted the rest of their lives. They visited each other every year, celebrating birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. Whenever they were apart, they spoke on the phone almost weekly. Once a journalist asked Franz whether he had ever regretted not shooting the B-17 down. Franz shook his head and smiled. "No," he said simply, "I would have lost my soul that day." As the years passed, their story began to spread. Newspapers, documentaries, interviews. People were drawn to it because it wasn't just a war story. It was a story about conscience, about two men who proved that humanity can survive even when everything else is burning. In 2008, after nearly 2 decades of friendship, the two men passed away within months of each other. Friends said that when Charlie Brown died, Franz Stigler was heartbroken. "I lost my brother," he told a friend shortly before his own death. Today their story is told around the world, in classrooms, in museums, in hangars where the echoes of engines still hum in the air. And somewhere above the clouds, perhaps, two old pilots fly together again, side by side, bound not by war, but by mercy. Time has a way of reducing wars to dates and numbers, names of battles, casualty counts, the movements of armies across maps. But behind every statistic are human choices, made in moments that last only seconds, yet echo for generations. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is one of those rare moments, a story that refuses to fade because it speaks not of victory or defeat, but of conscience. When historians later revisited their encounter, they tried to place it within the broader fabric of World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, fought across continents, leaving more than 70 million dead. It was a war of ideology, technology, and survival. Yet amid its brutality, there were still flickers of decency, moments where soldiers acted not out of hatred, but humanity. The meeting above the skies of Bremen was one such flicker. It was not supposed to happen. By every rule of war, it made no sense. But history is shaped as much by those who obey their conscience as by those who obey their orders. In the years after their reunion, Brown and Stigler were invited to speak at military academies, schools, and aviation events. They stood together before young pilots, men and women born long after the war, and spoke not of dogfights or tactics, but of morality. Franz would often begin with quiet conviction. When you have another man's life in your hands, you must ask yourself, what kind of man do I want to be when the war is over? Charlie would follow, his voice trembling with memory. That day, my life was spared by someone I had been taught to hate. I learned that courage isn't just pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's refusing to. Audiences listened in silence. Some cried. Others stood, moved by the sight of these two old men, one who had flown for the Allies, one for the Axis, bound together not by blood or nation, but by a single act of compassion that transcended both. Their friendship became a symbol of what historians began to call reconciliation through remembrance, the idea that even after the worst of wars, humanity can reclaim its dignity by remembering its moments of grace. Letters from around the world poured in. Veterans wrote to them, saying their story had helped them forgive others, or themselves. Young people wrote that it changed how they understood history, that it made them believe in something better than vengeance. In 2007, just a year before they both passed away, a small ceremony was held in Seattle. The two men sat side by side, frail but smiling, as an American flag and a German flag were raised together in their honor. No speeches, no grand fanfare, only quiet applause and the hum of engines from a restored B-17 flying overhead. When the bomber passed above, both men looked up. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and they smiled. They had come full circle, from enemies to brothers, from war to peace. After their deaths, they were buried thousands of miles apart. Charlie in the United States, Franz in Canada, but their names are now inscribed side by side on a plaque at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. It reads, "Enemies met in the skies of war, brothers found in the peace of forgiveness." Their story lives on, not because it is extraordinary, but because it is deeply human. It reminds us that history's truest lessons are not written in treaties or victories, but in moments when individuals choose decency over destruction. In every war there are orders, there is duty, there is fear. But once in a lifetime there is a choice, the kind that defines a person long after the guns fall silent. For Franz Stigler, that choice came in December 1943, when he placed his finger on the trigger and decided not to pull it. For Charlie Brown, it came in the years that followed, when he chose to seek not revenge but understanding. Their paths crossed for less than 10 minutes in the cold skies of Germany. Yet those 10 minutes changed both their lives, and perhaps in some small way, changed how the rest of us understand the meaning of mercy. Because when the world remembers war, it often remembers what divides us. But when it remembers them, it remembers what unites us. Two men, two enemies, one act of grace. And the lesson that still echoes, even in war, humanity can survive. The years roll on, and the men who fought the Second World War grow fewer with each passing season. Their memories, once vivid as fire, now rest in archives, in the quiet corners of museums, in the faded ink of letters sent across oceans. But some stories, a rare few, continue to live, not because of the war they describe, but because of the peace they promise. On a clear day, when the clouds hang low and sunlight spills across the horizon, one might imagine a silver bomber limping through the sky, engines coughing, wings torn, and beside it, a single fighter gliding in silent formation, two silhouettes suspended between life and death, between duty and compassion. That moment in December 1943 remains suspended in time, as if the air itself refused to let it fade. It reminds us that in the midst of destruction, there can still be a spark of mercy, that the truest victory is not survival, but the preservation of one's soul. Historians often describe the encounter between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler as a miracle of the air, but perhaps it was something simpler, A man alone in his cockpit, listening to the better voice within him, a moment of conscience made visible across the vast emptiness of the sky. When people ask what the story means, they often search for lessons, that enemies can become friends, that forgiveness can outlive hatred, that even the smallest kindness can echo through history. And all of that is true. But above all, it shows us something profoundly human, that in the darkest of times, a single act of compassion can pierce through the storm. In their final years, Charlie and Franz would often write to one another. Their letters were short, gentle, filled with the kind of quiet affection only old friends share. One of the last messages Franz ever sent read simply, "The war made us enemies, but the sky made us brothers." Charlie kept that letter framed on his wall until the day he died. Now, decades later, their story is told to new generations, in classrooms, in documentaries, in hangars where the ghosts of old engines still whisper. Children who never knew the sound of war listen wide-eyed as they hear how one man chose mercy when the world demanded blood. And perhaps that is the true legacy of their meeting, not that it changed the course of the war, but that it changed the way we remember it. For war is fought by nations, but peace is made by individuals. So when the sky grows quiet and the last echoes of the engines fade, somewhere in the imagination of those who still believe in decency, two planes still fly side by side, one battered, one whole, moving together toward the light of the horizon. Enemies once, brothers forever.